Hello, dear friends, and welcome to the latest episode of The Conversation. It's a time when we address issues regarding race and racism, when we ask individuals from around the Falmouth community to chime in with us in response to a couple of questions. And we'll have some in-studio guests as well. And of course, I'm joined today by Onjalé Scott-Price, co-producer and co-host of The Conversation here on FCTV. So, it's been all about elections recently. If you're like me, you're grateful that votes have been cast, and we can now rid ourselves of some of those annoying commercials that have been running and ads we've been seeing from various candidates. But I guess that's a necessary evil as part of the democratic process, of which we are fortunate to be a part. So today we are going to be looking at the issue of voter suppression, particularly as it relates to race and racism. And we're going to be asking people to respond to two questions. One of them is, what concerns, if any, do you have concerning voter suppression, particularly as it relates to race and racism? And our second question will be, how do we motivate people to exercise that right if they are facing voter suppression? So those are two questions for the day. Why don't we go now to hear what our people on the street have to say in response to our first question.
Yes, I have a lot of concerns about voter suppression. I would start just with the term voter suppression. It sounds so benign. It's not just suppression, it's the deprivation of the constitutional rights of our fellow citizens. And it's systematic and it's widespread. So I have very deep concerns about voter suppression that's being used in racist ways, and even larger, just voter suppression that's being used largely in urban areas for political ends. This is a very serious infringement of people's constitutional rights.
Well, as a Cape Cod member, I don't think of voter suppression and concerns because I haven't faced any. But in the country or nationally, I do believe that those issues are very important. The redistricting of spaces and district lines and things like that, I think, are terrible, and that you have to get involved in the local politics to prevent those types of things.
Well, welcome back. Well, we've heard from a couple of folks on the street in response to our question about voter suppression and what concerns they might have, and we want to now bring our in-studio guests into the conversation as well. We are fortunate to be joined by several individuals who can speak to the subject from their own perspectives, their own points of view, and their own experiences. I want to introduce Joanna McWilliam. Joanna is a resident now of Falmouth since 2010, born in Los Angeles, California, the product of parents who were politically active and engaged in social justice issues. And she has had her own experiences around the issue of voter suppression, particularly back in the 60s when she had a chance to work with an organization called SCOPE. And I'm going to ask her to begin our conversation by sharing a little bit about how she got involved in SCOPE and what SCOPE was and the work in which it was involved. So welcome, Joanna, to The Conversation.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. Yes, I think for many of us, the Bloody Sunday experience on television of the peaceful protesters being attacked by by troopers, state troopers, and sheriffs, and so forth, and the violence that we saw against peaceful people protesting the right to vote motivated many of us. And in fact, Dr. King came to UCLA, where I had gone to school, and knew that there was an expectation that there would be pressure to pass a Voting Rights Act that year. And he wanted to be prepared for it. So he developed a program called SCOPE, the Summer Community Organization Project and Political Education Project. And it was meant to bring volunteers from different parts of the country to work on a voter registration program in 6 of the southern states. And so we joined with several other members, and we drove across the country, and we were trained in Atlanta by some remarkable people and then sent out to our respective counties. And that summer, there were 49,000 voters that were registered. And in that summer of August 7th, I believe it was early August, Lyndon Johnson signed the Voter Registration Act, which, as you know, in 2013, the Supreme Court bludgeoned. But for that time, we did work in communities that were quite poor. And in one place in Georgia, in one of the counties, just under 50% of the community of Black Americans were functionally illiterate over 25 because the educational system had been so terrible. And the intimidation that we saw when we were doing our literacy workshops and taking people to the polls to register, and they were shouted at, and it was an eye-opening for all of us. And I think it very much, and so as a result of that, I wrote a little piece when the 2013 decision came down from the Supreme Court to gut the pre-clearance requirement for states to change their voter laws. And it was very sad because many people were beaten, and I myself was coming back from a freedom rally. We were living with Black families in the South, and they tried to turn my car over. And one of the things, we had one of our volunteers, Leroy Moten, who you may remember was riding with Viola Liuzzo when she was shot, and whether that bullet was meant for him or not. But the idea was, as we were trained, never to have anyone go on a parallel side to you. You go off in the ditch. And so we did. And our host family lost his job. Signs were cut up. We had a freedom rally in front of the courthouse with the Robert E. Lee statue. And the American Nazi Party, headquartered and founded in Arlington, Virginia, sent one of their hate buses down, and they put in huge bags of wasps and hornets in the hedges around the rally. And so we were quickly dispersed. But our job was also to check on public accommodations, to see whether or not the laws were being followed, to oppose the white signs only, for whites only. So between the literacy workshops, the voter registration, it was a busy summer, but it was a very worthwhile summer. And I met some of the most amazing people. There is a book that's been written about it called The Bright Spot Hours by a Californian. And I sadly don't have the book, but it's coming on Friday. Just kind of summarize the summer. But I think it changed all of us.
Well, that was indeed a summer that I actually remember myself. And that was the summer when John Lewis was beaten at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That's also the summer when other freedom writers were murdered, remembering especially Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. And as I was preparing for this show, Joanna, and I saw that you had been among those going to the South and engaging in that very courageous work, I was reminded of Jonathan Myrick Daniels, a name probably not well known to most folks, but Jonathan Daniels was a seminary student at the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge. And he also went south in 1965 to register people to vote. And he had been arrested, like many folks were, and was released along with others with whom he was working. And as they were walking down the street, he saw a young Black woman by the name of Ruby Sales, being accosted and cursed at, and he decided to step in front of her to protect her from the vitriol that was being spewed at her, the venom that was coming at her, and Jonathan Myrick Daniels was killed by a shotgun blast that was intended for the young black girl, Ruby Sales. And we in the Episcopal Church continue to honor Jonathan Myrick Daniels every August 14th. We actually consider that his feast day. But it points out just how dangerous it was, and how those who were suppressing the vote or trying to suppress the votes of black and brown people went to extremes in using violence, extreme violence, to terrorize people and to keep them from exercising what should have been their right, or was with their right. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that history, and I'm going to ask Angie if she would introduce Mark and engage him in sharing a bit about the history of voter suppression, particularly as it relates to race and racism.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have my friend Mark with us. He is an associate professor of history and social science at the Education Association in Woods Hole. He has a Ph.D. in history from Loyola University Chicago and a BA in political science from Auburn. And it's my understanding that when you worked on your Ph.D., you studied Reconstruction in Florida. And we always joke, Florida is an interesting place. So could you tell us a little bit about what you learned as it pertains to voter suppression and voting in history when you were doing your research?
Sure, yes. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. My work was on broadly on the settlement of Florida in the post-Civil War period, and specifically focused on the era of Reconstruction in the late 19th century. It was an interesting place in a lot of ways because the peninsula of Florida was largely unsettled after the Civil War. And so there was this sort of significant influx of Northerners down to the peninsula. And it became, in some ways, a sort of battleground between Northerners who are interested in sort of creating a sort of let's say a progressive sort of toehold in the South, and the Southerners who had been in the state already. Harriet Beecher Stowe, for instance, bought a house in Florida after the war, and a lot of the Beechers and the Stowes moved down and brought and called for other sort of Northerners to move down as well. And so there was this sort of fascinating moment. This is what intrigued me about it at the time, in which there was this sort of this play. Florida was seen as a sort of a place where Northerners could, to quote one of them, vote them out, right? So in a way that they could sort of create this sort of this different model for Reconstruction in the South, because it had been functionally an empty space at the time. So there was a lot of conflict, obviously, around black voting in that period. In my work, a lot of what I was looking at was the sort of ways in which voting was seen as a sort of tool by these Northern immigrants and developers to try and sort of further their own cause and establish a kind of powerful and functioning Republican Party in the state. Republican Party of the late 19th century, right, in that sense. And there was a lot of, in fact, fostering of that in a very unique way. And what was interesting to me is that as the 19th century comes to a close, this sort of part of Florida moved from being a fairly tolerant place to sort of being re-Southernized in a way that carries on to the 20th century. So you have people like Henry Sanford, for instance, for whom the town Sanford, Florida is named, which Trump had a rally in Sanford, I think 2 weeks ago, right? And it's a town that became infamous, I've lost track of time now, 10 years back, the murder of Trayvon Martin in Sanford. But so again, a town established by Henry Sanford, who was himself a member of the Republican Party. He was Lincoln's sort of ambassador to Belgium and had a lot of connections in the Republican Party, and who thought this would be helpful for him to advance his career. So there's this weird sort of conjunction of a kind of sort of I guess, protective nature of Black voting in Florida in this period by these sort of Northerners who thought this was, in some ways, the right thing to do, but also a very convenient thing for them to do to sort of consolidate their control of Florida. But in the end, that failed, and there's this sort of wave of repression that sort of envelops the state shortly after.
Mark, I appreciate you referencing Sanford, Florida. So if you notice the jersey behind me, it has the number of 42 on it, and that was the number of Jackie Robinson.
Jackie Robinson.
And Jackie was abused unmercifully in Sanford, Florida.
Yes, he was.
Is one of the scenes, if you've seen the movie 42, if you haven't, I encourage you to see it. But it highlights some of the racism, some of the abuse that his wife, Rachel, and he had to endure in Sanford. So Sanford has indeed quite a history. We want to talk a little bit more about the history before we move to talking about the present day. But let's stay with the history and ask Anji to introduce our next guest and see what contributions, what comments Lynne might want to make to this part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to welcome Lynne on with us. Thanks for being here. I understand you're born and raised in Falmouth. You went to college and majored in social work and human development, and you're now appointed to the Town of Falmouth Affirmative Action and Diversity Committee, and you were a town meeting member for Precinct 8, and you're also elected to the Falmouth Democratic Town Committee Executive Board and a member of the Cape Cod branch of the NAACP. So obviously you're very involved here on the Cape, especially around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So yeah, do you have any thoughts about voter suppression as it pertains to race, and if any, particularly here on the Cape?
So thank you for inviting me. I welcome the opportunity to talk. As I'm listening to what Mark had to say, I'm reminded of my late father. He went to school in the 60s in Florida. He went to Florida A&M. And I would hear a lot of stories of he and another person here on Cape would travel down by bus to Florida, and all of the stories he would tell me about the segregation and separating whites from blacks. And he was involved in the voter registration movement, which I think, as I sit and listen now, I am 51 years old. I am as old as my grandfather was when he first was allowed to vote. As I see all of the conflict that's going on and the different ways of voter suppression, intimidating people, trying to silence them, people who have signs on their lawns, Black Lives Matter, or that are supporting progressive movements, how they're slowly being vandalized or victimized in some way. As much as it brings up a sense of fear, it also brings up a sense of duty to remind myself of all the people who lost their lives, of all the times my dad sat in jail, even though he was never arrested, for my right and my privilege to vote. And I'm humbled to remember that. And it's really kind of unsettling. And I was brought up to remember what's Plan Action B. So if someone says, you know, if I go up to vote and I'm blocked, I have a bill in my hand that says, this is my address, I have my license, I have things that show I am legitimate to vote. Things that we normally wouldn't need. And here on the Cape, I have not needed, but when I lived in Central Mass, I did. So it's not necessarily prominent here on Cape Cod, but it does feel like as more and more white supremacist groups are gaining confidence and gaining an audience with our president, they are more emboldened to act out.
Lynn, thank you for that contribution. You know, the reference you made to the number of Black Lives Matter signs being vandalized and stolen, destroyed, reminds me of an incident just in the last few days here in Falmouth. I don't know how much publicity it's gotten at this point, but someone in the Hatchville section had a sign stolen from their front yard, and someone replaced it with a head of a black doll that had been severed from the body and left that in their front yard, and with an epithet, a in lover. And so that kind of terrorizing that was going on, that Joanna and Mark were talking about, and you talked about, Lynn, from the 60s and before, is still present here today. So I'm going to turn our conversation a little bit to, if we can, to what our two individuals had to offer in their on the street responses to the question, what concerns, if any, do you have about voter suppression as it pertains to race and racism? And I think some of what they said has been echoed by you here. But one of the individuals said the term voter suppression sounds so benign, right? It just sounds like, oh, voter suppression. How bad could that be? No? But as he said, it represents the deprivation of constitutional rights, particularly of Black and brown people, and that it's systemic and that it's widespread, and that we all have a role to play, particularly people who are white, to make sure that Black and brown people have the freedom to exercise that right. And then, as you were saying, there was a comment was made by one of the respondents' interviews that, well, you don't face it on Cape Cod, that you don't face overt voter suppression. I would argue that there is maybe not overt, but covert suppression. And I think when someone cuts off the head of a doll, of a black doll, and leaves it in someone's front yard, that certainly is a form of intimidation. So let me just open it up to whoever would like to respond to what you heard in the interviews or that's been shared here.
So for myself, so I see how people, so what experience for me off Cape, which I sure see can happen here on Cape, is I had 3 opportunities of voting in a row. The first time I went in, I gave my street address. The woman said I was in the wrong place and would go back and forth with me, and she wouldn't look in her registry. And I finally convinced her to look in her registry when I started to yell really loudly for a supervisor or whoever was in charge to come check, because I had actually checked with the town to determine I was in the right voting place. After going back and forth and asking for a supervisor, and I appreciate my parents for teaching me at times to be bold in situations like that, because I'm normally can be quiet, and there are people who would just not respond, and then they would go to another voting place and a third voting place when they were actually in the right place. That happened 2 years in a row, and I thought it really odd. And I made sure that I had a utility bill, I had my license, and I had a copy of where I was supposed to be registered. And the third time I showed up, they didn't even have me on the registry. And so the response was, okay, well, we'll give you a provisional ballot. Come sit over with me. And we set up the provisional ballot. I have traditionally at that time signed up as unenrolled and ended up being enrolled as a Republican.
Ooh.
At which point I made sure that I enrolled as a Democrat to offset that. But it was a general election, so my party affiliation did not really matter at that point. But that's how people kind of remove you, from being able to register. So if you don't know what information you need and you show up and you're not on the registry, most people go away and don't stop to, encourage people to, yes, I'm here, I need to be here, and I'm, a registered voter. So that, I don't know how much that happens, but I'm sure it does. And people don't say anything because it is perceived that it's somehow I did something wrong to not be registered, when that's not necessarily the case.
So let me ask Mark. Go ahead, Joanna. Were you about to say something?
No, I think that, what we've seen since 2013, the courts, which are supposed to protect the right of citizens to vote, have not done that. And I was looking through the different decisions that have come down from the conservative court since that time. In fact, I even have the, after that bill was passed and made into an act, the Voting Rights Act, the number of Black voters increased so dramatically after that bill. And now you see there are efforts to kind of restrict not just the Black vote, but a political party that you don't want to see in power. I mean, in democratic areas and so forth, additionally to minority groups as well. But each of these decisions, as I was looking at them, I think to myself that John Roberts should be crying in his boots after gutting that 65 voting rights by saying, well, it's 40 years ago, the conditions have changed, but they really haven't changed. And we see that right now. That's all I have to say.
Well, that was well said. Thank you. Mark, as a political scientist, what are you seeing in terms of a repeat of history? What's the saying? Those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it, but it seems like we are repeating it.
Right, exactly. It does feel like that, and anecdotally, that 2012 was the first election in which, in the modern era, in which Black voter participation eclipsed white voter participation, and so the 2013 ruling that comes a year later may be coincidental or it may not be coincidental, but certainly the gutting of the sort of the protection, at least in southern states, right, the sort of the pre-qualification requirements, removing that is problematic. And shortly after that, you see counties and states in the South in particular begin to pass a number of laws because they no longer need pre-clearance or are required to get pre-clearance. So, there is, I think there's, from my perspective, a lot of ways in which the vote is suppressed. And some of it is just systematic and isn't necessarily targeted at particular audiences. And so you have, just comparing U.S. elections to other advanced democracies, you see, countries that where the government registers people rather than having the onus be on the individuals to become registered voters. Right? There's all kinds of ways that friction is created to diminish the sort of the participation in the democratic process. And the Trump administration, Trump himself has said out loud parts that have been silent for a long time, which is that, well, if we let lots of people vote, Republicans won't win elections, and the fact that he's willing to say that out loud is both astonishing and I think quite revealing. The registration process is arcane. The fact that, the election falls on a Tuesday and it's not a holiday is, kind of interesting at best. There's a lot of ways in which there's a general structural level for repressing votes broadly, but there's no doubt that there's a lot of ways in which that is targeted at particular populations. And I did voter registration both in Alabama as a young college student at Auburn University in the early 80s. And so 20 years, after you were doing this voter registration, Joanna, I was down there and getting some of the same thing. Now, I went to Auburn University, which is in Lee County, Alabama, and I went to Opelika, which is where the county courthouse is, working with a local group to try and to register voters. And I was told by the person at the courthouse that she would not deputize me as a registrar, which was complete violation of the law. And so I too was a quiet person and sort of went back home and sort of talked to the folks I was working with, and they said, no, they have no legal right to do that. So I got myself back to the county courthouse in Opelika and did get deputized as a registrar and engaged in voter registration there. I did the same in Florida when I was teaching at the University of Central Florida in Orlando area. I was doing voter registration there. And another structural way that I found it to be just striking was a number of African American, particularly men that I talked to who had lost their right to vote because of time in prison. And that was just a massive number of folks for whom voting was at that point just barred from them for them. There has been some turnaround in that in Florida because of a statewide ballot initiative, which tried to overturn that. But the state legislature has done everything it could to prevent that ballot initiative from having teeth. So there are, the structural barriers are real, and they are they're effective, I think, to a point.
I want to bring Angie in and talk a little bit, get her perspective on some of this. But both Joanna and you, Mark, have mentioned the Voting Rights Act and the decision in 2013, I believe it was, by the Supreme Court to basically gut it by removing the term you've used as pre-clearance. So can you help our viewers, Mark, Joanna, can you help them understand what that meant and what that pre-clearance was about and how it gutted the Voting Rights Act?
Mark, you're probably better, but I do know that in fact, before any voting changes could be made, electoral changes could be made in these southern states, and you're right, this is going on right now in Wisconsin and the Dakotas and everything. The voting rights just applied to the southern states. It had to be cleared by the Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office, and so there was a kind of was difficult to get by with some of the things we see, closing of polls and photo IDs, and now notary publics and adult witnesses and all the stuff that we see going on right now. That couldn't have happened before. And it's yet happening right now. So it did remove some of the barriers to doing these extreme kind of suppression efforts that are being made. But Mark, you probably know more about it than I do. So
no, I mean that's a great summation. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't study constitutional law or history, but the general sort of issue is that the Voting Rights Act basically, because of the long history in the South, post Civil War, of suppressing, specifically targeting Black voters in the South. The law sort of singled out the states of the former Confederacy and said that these states have a particular onus to prove that what they're doing is not in fact targeting Black voters, and so that they were required, as mentioned, to get pre-clearance on any change in voting regulations, right? So that the Justice Department could look at it and see that it was in fact race neutral in a sense, right? And it was effective. I mean, the truth is that after the 15th Amendment, Southern states passed all kinds of barriers to voting that targeted Black voters, but that were in a sense race neutral. So poll taxes themselves, are literacy tests. None of these things say, people of color can't vote, but clearly that's who they're targeting. And so the Justice Department, I think, did a very good job for, while it could, of trying to vet Southern laws and changes in Southern voting regulations to prevent that. But once that's removed, the argument was there's still a remedy. That is, after the fact, you can sue the state, or you can bring to the state or the county to court and say, this change systematically disenfranchised people of color. But that happens after the election, right? You have to have a standing to sue, right? Whereas before the 2013 decision, that the onus was on the state to prove that it wasn't doing something wrong, whereas now the onus is on the individual to prove the state or the county had done something wrong. So it really shifts the burden dramatically.
I have to say, I have learned so much in the last, however long we've been on, than I learned in any civics or government or history class that I've ever taken. I did not understand the importance of our voting rights until a few years ago. My husband and I were living on the eastern shore of Maryland, and he was still registered to vote in North Carolina, and he couldn't do an absentee ballot. I don't recall if it was because he had been out of state for so long, whatever. So we drove 3.5 hours each way just so he could cast his ballot. And I recall people saying, well, that seems like a waste of energy. It's just one vote. And we're like, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of people died and were hurt just to give us the right to vote. The least I can do is sit in my comfortable car for 7 hours to go cast my ballot. But I will say that I did not understand the extent of voter suppression in the past and how it relates to the future until very recently, until February. We had Dr. Daniel Black from Clark Atlanta University come to Woods Hole as part of our Black History Month events. And he brought one of the, wasn't a literacy form, but it was whatever it was called, that someone had to be able to answer all these ridiculous questions about the government and state laws. And nobody in that room would have passed. And yet we've all been through school. Most of us had been through college, and yet we still weren't going to be able to answer those questions. So to imagine people not even that long ago, 30, 40 years ago, having to answer these questions and studying just to be able to cast their ballot, which should have been a constitutional right, really changed my mindset about how important voting was. I knew it was important. I knew it was a thing that I needed to do, but that really put me in a mindset of understanding how important the vote is and why certain groups of people want to suppress the vote, because they understand how powerful the vote is and how powerful our voice can be. The idea that if less people voted, we keep more Republicans in power tells you where the people actually want to be. And so the people, the Republicans, generally speaking, who are in power want to suppress voting because they know that will get them out of power. And that concept is, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that in general. But I want to say I really appreciate you all for educating me and hopefully the public, especially on this topic, because I feel like I've learned so much already.
Do you know how people were able to work around that literacy exam?
No, I don't.
There was a clause that said, if you had family history where you had a parent that, or in your lineage, that was eligible to vote the year before slavery was abolished, you were exempt from having to take that test to certify yourself.
It was grandfathered.
Yeah, you were grandfathered in.
Ah, got it. But that wouldn't have applied to me, likely.
And so that was very targeted.
To a lot of white people, so it basically meant they didn't have to take the exam.
Right. They didn't have to prove how smart they were. They didn't have to pass that
That's
exam in order to qualify to vote. They could just say, look, my third generation grandparent voted, therefore I'm grandfathered in.
Right, because that completely
quite
makes
remarkably sense. With the current purging of voters who have not voted within 6 years regularly, they can be purged from the voter roll. Something like 824 were purged because they hadn't voted regularly within the past 6 years. So voter purges are happening right now. I mean, it's shocking, but true.
Yeah, they happened. I'm sorry.
That happens in Massachusetts. If you don't stay on every year, you get dropped as well. Every January, we have a registration.
That's very good to know.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that, you know, the government, we have a system in which it's states who run elections, right? So because of our federal system, our federated system, it's a little different than a lot of states, nation states that elections are run, through the central government. So we have functionally 50 plus different systems for voting, which is itself a bit arcane and Byzantine. But there's also within that, there's a lot of room for individual actors to influence the outcome within the sort of context of the law that allows leeway, right? So we had Secretary of State in Georgia, for instance, running for governor a few years ago, who simply failed to certify registration. I can't remember the number was, but well over tens of thousands, I believe, new voter registrations that weren't certified because they didn't match exactly the data set the state had to work with, right? So Jeb Bush purged a number of voters in Florida in 2000, before the 2000 election, and it was coincidental, perhaps, that his brother was on the ticket in that election. But I mean, there's a lot of ways in which individual actors within the state, different states and counties, can use existing laws to further their own interests.
So, Mark, you sound a lot less cynical than I am, but okay. So, and I remember hearing my aunts and uncles and grandparents talking about poll taxes. And so, if you're poor, you can't get a job because you're being discriminated against. You don't have the money to pay the poll tax. Hearing stories about having to count the number of jelly beans in a jar, and just all these efforts to suppress, to keep people from voting. When we say in this country we cherish the right to vote, that is something we celebrate, yet we make it so difficult. So why don't we go now to back to the street to hear what our folks there have to say about what can be done. What can be done in the face of these efforts to get people out to exercise their franchise. We'll be back just after this, and I'll ask Lynne if you will respond when we get back.
You get people to vote in light of the suppression efforts as a personal thing, I think. You want to fight against any type of oppression, and voting rights are the most important, or one of the most important rights that we have as people. So I'd say get involved. You have to be upfront with your vote. Go ahead and vote, but also talk to your politicians and get involved in the local level. So any way you can, I say that if you're quiet, nobody's going to speak for you. So speak for yourself.
Can voter suppression be so suppressive that it actually keeps people from voting, just like giving up? I think that's not the case. I think what we're seeing is, in fact, the more voter suppression, and these are, again, overt acts of depriving people of their constitutional rights, I hope that motivates people to vote even more, because, and everybody, I hope it motivates everybody to vote more and to protect the constitutional rights of our fellow citizens. So not just the people to whom voter suppression is directed against, which tends to be against people of color and in urban areas, but hopefully all of us realize that this is completely unacceptable. And I want everybody to vote more. I want especially places that are targeted for voter suppression to vote more. But it's the duty of all of us as citizens to protect the rights of our fellow citizens.
Well, welcome back. Quite a bit to digest there, and I'm going to ask Lynne if she would start our conversation, this part of the conversation, with responding to what she heard from those interviews on the street. How do you motivate people to vote in light of voter suppression efforts? Lynne, what's your thought?
Oh, it's really, if people have a barrier, they need to tell their friends. We need to work together as a community. If you need a ride, call somebody. If you have problems, offer. I know I offered to help somebody who is having problems with his vision to fill out his ballot, and to be his signer designee. So to take time to make sure that you are registered. I don't know if the deadline is passed or not, but one of the things I've learned over the years, especially with my last experience of being removed, on my birthday, I go in and check the registry to make sure that I am registered to vote, even if there's nothing voting for. you know. So taking steps to make sure you are on the records. If you need to have some sort of concrete bill that says you live where you do, if you need to make a provisional ballot, and just keep on top of it. My motivating factor is I had two parents that were actively involved in getting people registered, and listening to all the stories of what they had to go through so I could vote reminds me that I do this for them. I do this for my grandparents for all of the years they were not able to. And just, you know, if you have something that's a barrier, just to tell somebody, let people help you get this done.
You know, one of the respondents on the street said something similarly, that it's a personal thing, and you've got to talk to your local politicians, talk to whomever, to make sure you're not being disenfranchised. But I wonder, Joanna, what are your thoughts in response to that?
Well, I think this is a pandemic that we're talking about. And so these regulations and these restrictions are even more severe. When you require older people, where is it, in Alabama, to require them to not only submit a photo ID, if you're over 65, you're given permission not to vote, as well as a notary public affidavit, or two adult witnesses signed on your ballot, that's out of the question. I mean, who really wants to go and stand in line for 6 hours that people have been forced to do in an era of pandemic? I mean, people should be allowed to mail in their votes. I mean, it's incredible to my mind that Alabama can get away with it. And then the curbside voting, which has just been denied because people don't want to walk into a place where they can be exposed. I mean, the regulations seem so outrageous in a time of real concern about health, and particularly for older people. It's discouraging.
Yep. So why don't we have, Mark, you said earlier, why are we voting on Tuesdays, and you know, why don't we do it on a Saturday? And I mean, why don't we go to, here's an idea, internet voting. Oh, we could do it on the internet. We could have people register, have people register on the internet, or register them at birth, the way we do with a birth certificate, right? Make them eligible to vote, and then make it easier for people to vote. So why don't we want people to have easy access to this right?
You're asking me specifically?
I'm hoping.
Or no?
So yeah.
Yeah, I wish. So one thing I would do is maybe deconstruct the we, right? So, and at the risk of being the cynic again, perhaps. I mean, we just had one of our fellow citizens vote from the International Space Station the other day, right? I mean, it is possible that we can get people to vote in all kinds of situations. Yeah. The question is, you know, where is the will to do that? And I don't mean to pick on a particular party, but Senator Mike Lee recently tweeted that we are not a democracy, we're a republic, right? This is an old talking point from really from back in the 1950s, even from the John Birch Society, this notion that there is no sort of constitutional drive to guarantee democracy because we're actually a republic in our foundation. So I think that that one of the things that we have to do is to really address this at a structural level and have conversations like the ones we're having right now, and say that we to turn the rhetoric on its head and say the burden belongs to the state, right, not to the individuals, right? And any time that we accept that the burden to vote is ours, and the burden to be registered, and the burden to have the right to vote is ours, rather than it's sort of structural, is in a sense buying into the very system that makes it difficult, that creates the friction that makes it difficult. So, you know, I think as much as we can try and talk about the need to have structures in place that encourage voting rather than inhibit voting is really important.
Angie, do you have a question for our folks?
Not necessarily a question, but one thing that I would like to touch on is local elections. I will say that the first time I ever voted was in 2012 because I'm sorry, not 2012, 2008, because that was the first time I was eligible to vote for a presidential election. I realize I'm aging myself or unaging myself. Anyway, and since then, I think I've only voted until I moved to Falmouth, I'd only voted in one local or state election because I was just like, I don't know who these people are. I don't understand what they do. I don't really think it's important. And one thing I will say about the 2016 election and things that have followed after, I've now have a better understanding of why voting for your congressperson is so important and why voting for your senator is so important. So thinking about what Mark just said about the systems and putting the burden back on the state, where the individual comes in is who do you vote for? Are you going to vote for someone that's going to look at ways to break down those systems? Or are you going to vote for someone who has said or has voted in ways to uphold those systems? And so I think as we think about voting, obviously all of our minds are on the presidential election next week, but also keeping in mind that local and state voting is, if not more important, just as important as the presidential elections. And I will say that I think part of the reason why I didn't know how important they were is because it was never taught. And why was it never taught is because the more you know, the more you vote, the more you participate, the more people participate, the less the current people in power have power. And so that goes just back to these systems that are already in place that I think we need to break down, take a little bit of the burden. But I really like what Mark said, is passing the burden back to the state and the government to do their part to break down the system.
Onjalé, I was really shocked when I found out that civics classes were not required in Massachusetts. I couldn't actually believe it, but it's true. And it goes back to very much what you were saying. In California, they were considered vital. There was no choice. They were required. And here I find it quite shocking that this is not the case. I was really surprised.
I see Lynne smiling in response to that.
I am smiling because my mother is a history, civics, social studies teacher and would drill us with all of this knowledge when we were young. And I am saying I apologize for any bad thought I had, because she taught me things I didn't learn in school. It didn't occur to me that there was a gap in the education piece because I knew it already. And I just thank her. She rest her soul, but I just, wow, it just reminds me of how grateful I am to have the parents that I had who were advocates, and they really instilled a level of discipline and a level of civic duty and obligation.
But think of people who didn't have parents like you, who don't know the basic structural systems.
Yes. Yes, and that's been a real interesting kind of, as you get into the debate or the politics, and people don't understand all of the disenfranchisement and how it's so ingrained that it's invisible, and it's really hard to go against what public opinion says because they don't know any different.
Civics courses were among my favorite courses when they were teaching them, and I was coming through, elementary school and junior high school and all, and then all of a sudden they stopped teaching it. And I think, Joanna, you're right. That's one of the reasons we have the situation we have today. So let me ask you all this. This was one of the responses that we just heard from the street, that the argument was being made that the more voter suppression, the more overt voter suppression we are aware of, that motivates more people to go and vote. So the more we hear in the news, in the media, that there are these efforts at voter suppression, the more that information gets out, that will draw more people to want to get out to vote in response to that. What do you all think about that?
Well, it certainly seems to be, considering the number of people who've already registered and voted, it certainly seems to be true this election. We'll have to see, but so many mail-in votes and so many early voting voters have voted already that it's quite extraordinary.
I have to agree. I'm not a big social media person, but I do get on Twitter quite often, actually. And I've seen a lot of commentary about young people specifically saying, well, they being the system at large is obviously trying to suppress my vote because it matters and it's important. And so I'm going to make sure I take that opportunity to use it. And I also think with what's going on with the pandemic and the social unrest that's particularly happening now is that a lot of people are not feeling that their voice is heard on so many matters and in so many ways. And so if this is the place that I can have my voice heard and I can make a difference and I can enact even a small part of change, I'm going to take advantage of it. And I do think, as Joanna was bringing up, when it comes to people who are at risk or the elderly population, I don't want to say that they shouldn't stand. I mean, no one should be standing in line. I mean, that obviously is a problem. But I can't speak for those people because I could imagine people saying, I do want to vote and I do want to take part and I am more motivated, but I physically cannot or I should not. And so I think as we think about who is feeling encouraged and who is actually able to stand in those lines, it's not the same demographic as all the people who actually wish they could participate.
I have a lot of friends that I am on social media. I'm on Facebook, and the number of friends that I have who are taking their free time and calling places like Tennessee, calling Georgia, calling Texas, calling Florida to encourage people to be registered to vote, all of the letter writing campaigns, the postcard campaigns. And I asked my friend, why? And her comment was she was laid off in March and her job no longer exists. She does not have health care. Here in Massachusetts, we have the Health Connector, which is a Mass Health participant for people who can't afford normal health insurance or can't afford COBRA. And she was feeling a moment of, wow, I have this, but if I lived in another state, that person doesn't, and I want to help that person. And so that's why she started doing her letter writing and started doing her phone calls. And it was a sense of, I have something that someone else does not have. And I was really surprised and impressed that she actually had that thought process to do that. And that just motivated her even more, and just to keep going and keep trying to just one more person, one more letter.
So perhaps you're all expressing a bit of hope that we won't remain in this situation forever, maybe even not much longer. I do know that people are going to extreme ends. And I just heard a couple of days ago about sort of like you, Angie, saying Andre and you drove from, what was it, DC to North Carolina to vote. I just heard just a couple of days ago, someone is flying in the midst of a pandemic. They're flying from, I think, Illinois or someplace like that, back to Colorado just to vote, just so they can cast their vote. That's how committed this person is and how important this person considers exercising their right. So in the last couple of minutes that we have, since I've brought up the issue of hope, which Onjalé understands is part of my nature because it's connected to my vocation, which is to bring hope to people and to the world. Tell us in a kind of a closing comment from each of you, if you like, where do you see the hope in the midst of these mammoth efforts to suppress the individual right to vote?
I see it in the lines of people spending hours hours and hours for the right to vote, and seemingly willingly do it and hopefully doing it. And so that gives me some hope.
I think I remember hearing somebody, and I don't know the quote exactly, but it's along the line of progress isn't a straight line, that it zags, and that this may be a temporary setback, but in the long haul, if we keep our eye on what the bigger picture is, we'll get there. And, reading the stories and the vignettes of people of what they had to do to vote this time around, and, hearing about a gentleman who was standing behind a mother with her two kids, and she kept telling her two kids, like, we have to vote, we have to vote. And that forced the man to stay in line, because if he left, then the two kids would start complaining, forcing her to leave, and then there would be this line of exodus. So there's a sense of we're in this together, and it feels like this is a mea culpa for the people who did not stay involved in 2016 to, remember, not taking part and not taking action, could lead to dire consequences.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I think, and I will say that I find a great deal of hope actually in the younger generation right now, with students that I teach, my daughter and her friends, because I think to go back to the conversation earlier about, does voter suppression in a sense backfire and encourage people to vote? And I think the answer there is that, the more that it's laid bare, the more that it's made evident to people, the more that it does have that effect, right? People get angry at being, in a sense, told that they can't do something that they believe they have the right to do and do have the right to do. And I think that, COVID itself, right? The idea, as Joanne said, that people are literally risking their lives to vote, right? Is a sense that, it makes people, it gets their back up, right? Like you're really forcing me to go out and potentially get, sort of face a pandemic situation in order to cast my ballot. Well, I'm going to do that, right? And I think climate change as an existential issue is similar, right? And I see a whole generation of folks for whom, the Black Lives Matter movement and climate change are so critically important, and they see that as almost as they see those issues as existential. And I think it really does force them to engage in conversations that are more honest and open than we've had in a long time. And I think that itself is what I take hope in. I think our national conversation has, in spite of rhetoric from certain corners of the nation, I think our national conversation broadly is way more honest than it has been in a very long time. And I know that runs counter to a lot of what we're hearing about, the rise of QAnon and all kinds of conspiracy theories. But I do take hope in that.
Give us your hope, Onjalé.
My hope is, I guess, in my generation, the quote younger generations, because I think in the way Mark said, of seeing all this blatant in our face on camera, having politicians say things and being able to listen to them again, it definitely puts us in a different perspective of these things are not things that happened 30, 40 years ago. They happened then, but they're still happening now. And it gives me hope that people like us are having these conversations to understand what are the issues, how did we get here? Because you can't move forward without knowing where you've been. So I think I have hope in conversations, hope in people asking questions, and hope in people being willing to do something, whether that's cast their ballot, volunteer, run for office, whatever it may be. That's what gives me hope, is people talking and figuring out how to move forward. Your turn.
Well, on that note, thank you for the prod, Onjalé. And let me first thank our guest today, Mark Long, Joanna McWilliam, Lynne Rhodes, our on the street interviewees. Once again, thanks to FCTV for this platform to have the conversation. And thanks to Alan Russell and Debbie Rogers, especially behind the scenes, putting this all together. You know, I am hopeful. I have hope in humanity. And I believe that all humans have goodness in them, and that it's possible to draw that out of people, particularly if we have these conversations, as several of you have said. My hope is that we will remember those who sacrificed so much for so long and who are still sacrificing to exercise this right, this simple but precious right to vote. Those who were beaten in Selma, Alabama, and many other places, to Jonathan Myrick Daniels, to Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, to Joanna McWilliam, and so many who literally put their lives on the line for Lynne's parents, for their efforts in the struggle, and for teaching her. And my hope is in Mark and the work he's doing to train young minds that are looking to him for tutelage. And so let's all remember those sacrifices that were made, and let's do our best efforts to resist and to make it possible for every person to have the right to indeed vote. So that's the conversation for this episode. Watch for another episode coming up later in the month of November. We're glad that you're with us, and don't forget, we may stop you on the street and ask you a question that will find its way into one of our shows as well. And with that, my thanks again to FCTV. Bye for now.